I didn't cry at the reading of the will. I sat perfectly still, hands folded, shoulders drawn back, lips tight enough to bleed if pressed. I wore the same pale gray blouse I'd bought years ago for my father's funeral. It felt appropriate. Before we continue, take a second to write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Now let's go back to the room where everything changed. The air was thick with tension so palpable that you could almost touch it. Claire felt it growing with every heartbeat tightening her chest. The lawyer's office in downtown Hartford reeked of old books' lemon polish, and something less tangible, something like finality. The smell of old decisions, of lines drawn, of family ghosts still whispering down mahogany halls. My brother David had his legs crossed leisurely beside me, drumming his fingers on the armrest, like he already knew how the story would end. I guess in some ways he did. He always knew he'd win. That was the thing about David. Even when we were kids, he never asked for anything. He expected it. I was the one who waited, who watched, who wondered what I'd done wrong when my birthday gifts were smaller, when praise came more often for him, who stayed quiet when Dad looked through me like I was a pane of glass, who smiled through holidays even when I was the one doing all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the caring. So when Mr. Landry cleared his throat and began reading my grandmother's will, I already knew the shape of what was coming. But knowing doesn't mean it hurts less. To my grandson, David Lawrence Whitman, I leave the condominium at 76 Lexington Avenue in New York City, fully paid with all contents therein. David's lips curled just slightly. His lawyer gave a subtle nod beside him, already half checking out like their part was done. My eyes stung. And then came my name. To my granddaughter, Claire Elise Whitman. I am leaving the property located at 9 Hollowbrook Road in the town of Gray Hill, Vermont, including all surrounding structures, land, and its contents. Silence. Thick, oily, humiliating silence. A broken farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. An old, weather-beaten structure that hadn't been spoken of in our family in decades. No heat, no plumbing last I heard. I remembered visiting once as a child, mosquitoes biting at my ankles, peeling wallpaper, a well that coughed dust. That house, that was my legacy. David turned to me with the same smug amusement he used when I flunked out of organic chemistry in college. Well, he muttered loud enough for the room to hear. I guess Grandma knew who the real achiever was. I said nothing. Not when the lawyer looked at me with polite pity. Not when the pens were handed over for signatures. Not even when David leaned in and whispered, "Maybe you can start a chicken farm or something. I hear Vermont's big on that." I took the envelope. The key was inside. Cold, small, heavy. The room was closing in on me by the time I made it to the sidewalk where my husband Eric waited in our car. I slid into the passenger seat and closed the door. He didn't even look up from his phone. "So what did you get?" My mouth was dry. "She left me the Gray Hill property." Eric blinked. "The what?" "The farmhouse," I whispered. He laughed. Not kindly. "You mean the dump with the tin roof and dead ivy growing through the siding?" "That house?" I nodded. His knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. "And David got the condo in Manhattan." I said nothing. He smacked the wheel. "Jesus, Claire. Do you ever win anything? I told you to talk to her, to explain all you've done. This was your chance to get ahead finally, and now you've got a shack. What the hell are we supposed to do with that?" I didn't exactly have a say. "You never have a say," he spat. "That's the problem." That one hurt more than I expected. Eric had always been the kind of man who measured worth in tangible things. Promotions, square footage, watch brands. A house in Vermont didn't even count as failure in his eyes. It was less than that. It was proof I didn't belong in his world to begin with. He was still ranting. About lost opportunities. About embarrassment. About me. You know what he said, pulling into traffic so hard the car jolted? "I can't do this anymore. I can't carry both of us. You're a grown woman, Claire. Start acting like it. Go deal with your shack. Maybe you'll finally learn something." I stared straight ahead, throat tight, heart hammering. "You're kicking me out?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer, but his silence was louder than anything else in that moment. That night I packed everything I could fit into 2 suitcases. No questions, no arguments, no tears. There were no calls from David, no concerned messages from anyone in the family. Not one person asked how I felt about being handed an unwanted ruin, while my brother got $1.4 million worth of polished flooring and skyline views. I bought a one-way bus ticket to Gray Hill, Vermont. I didn't look back. As the bus pulled away from Hartford's neon streets into the long, dark stretch of interstate, I watched the city shrink behind me. I didn't know what awaited me in that house. I didn't know what kind of woman I'd have to become to survive this. But I knew one thing: I was done letting other people decide my worth. Not Eric, not David, not even my grandmother. If that house was all I had left, then maybe, just maybe, it was time I found out why. And this time, no one was going to tell me to be quiet. The bus groaned as it climbed into the hills of Vermont, each turn tightening like a question I didn't yet have the answer to. I sat by the window, forehead resting against the glass, watching the world slip further away from everything familiar. Gray Hill wasn't even a dot on most maps. I had to zoom twice on my phone before the name popped up, tucked in a bend between endless pine and cracked roads. I remembered it only as a passing shadow from childhood, the place where my grandmother once lived before she got too old to be out there alone. No one ever said it, but I knew what they meant. Forgotten places were for forgotten people. I didn't pack much. 2 suitcases and a canvas tote with old notebooks, charger cords, a tin of mints, and the key. That rusted little piece of metal sat in the bottom like it weighed 5 pounds. Or maybe it was what it represented that carried the weight. The driver didn't announce the stop. He just looked at me through the rearview mirror and nodded once, slow and almost sorry. "This is it," he muttered. "Gray Hill." I stepped off into silence. There wasn't even a bus stop sign, just cracked pavement gravel and cold wind that tugged at my coat collar. The air smelled like wet soil and firewood. In the distance, I saw it, the house. It leaned slightly to one side like the earth had been trying to swallow it for decades, but changed its mind halfway. The paint was sun-bleached to a pale husk of blue. The shutters sagged like tired eyelids. Ivy crept over one wall like old scars refusing to fade. I tightened my grip on the suitcase handles. I should have cried, or panicked, or cursed, but all I felt was stillness. Not peace, not yet. Just that fragile quiet after something inside you gives up resisting. The walk to the front door felt longer than it should have. With each step, childhood memories clawed at the back of my mind, vague flashes sitting on a worn rug as Grandma sliced apples. A rocking chair. The way the sun used to pour through lace curtains and paint gold onto her hair. But that was before the house became legendary. Before it turned into a punchline for relatives who preferred city lights and clean, dry walls. When I reached the porch, I paused. The boards creaked beneath me like a warning. The key was cold in my palm as I slid it into the lock, half expecting it not to fit. But it did. Smooth, clean, as if someone had used it recently. I pushed open the door. No dust cloud greeted me. No musty mildew stench. The air smelled faintly of lavender soap and wood smoke, subtle, warm, almost welcoming. The house was clean, not pristine, not renovated, but tidy, cared for. The floors, though old, had been swept. The furniture was covered in plain white sheets, not the kind that said abandonment, but protection. Like someone had known this house would be lived in again and wanted it ready. My footsteps echoed lightly as I walked through the hallway. Faded photographs lined the walls. I paused at one, a girl with thick braids and shy eyes standing barefoot in a field of tall grass. Me. I hadn't seen that picture in 20 years. I didn't even remember it being taken. A strange ache pressed against my ribs. I moved room to room, kitchen, small parlor, a bedroom with a patchwork quilt still folded neatly at the foot of the bed. There was a softness to the place, an intentional quiet. This wasn't neglect. This was waiting. I didn't find the note until later that night. It was tucked inside a chipped ceramic bowl on the kitchen table, folded in half with my name written in the unmistakable curve of my grandmother's hand, Claire. I stared at it for a full minute before touching it. My hands were trembling. If you're reading this, my darling girl, it means the house has opened for you. And I'm glad. You were always meant to return. This place, it isn't just boards and nails. It remembers. It keeps secrets. And it keeps promises, too. I folded the note before finishing it. My chest felt too tight. I couldn't handle the rest. Not yet. I needed air. I stepped out onto the back porch and let the cold bite into my cheeks. The sky was a quilt of stars. No streetlights, no sirens. Just the deep hush of night pressing against the trees. Something in me shifted then quietly. I was still angry, still hurt. But there in that moment, I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Belonging. And that scared me more than anything else. The next morning, I wandered the house again, not to inspect, but to listen. You can laugh if you want, but that's what it felt like, the walls whispering, guiding me. That's when I noticed it. At the end of the hallway was a door I hadn't tried. It didn't look like much, almost camouflaged into the wood paneling, no frame, no doorknob, just a small iron latch. It resisted at first, but when I pulled again hard, it creaked open with a sound like the house exhaling after years of silence. Behind it, books. Shelves and shelves of books. My breath caught in my throat. A hidden library. Not just dusty old novels tossed in a box, but a full room, wall-to-wall shelving, floor-to-ceiling, every square inch packed. There was a tiny reading lamp in the corner, and an armchair with a frayed quilt draped over it, like someone had just stepped out for a minute and would return soon. Some of the books looked ancient, leather-bound, gold-embossed. Others were handwritten journals tied with ribbon lined up neatly, like someone had cared for each one, as if they were living things. I stepped inside, heart racing. Who was my grandmother? This woman who left me the house that everyone else joked about. This woman who never visited the city, who never made noise, who spent a lifetime collecting knowledge and hiding it. I reached for a book at random. The spine cracked delicately in my hands. The pages were cream-colored, the ink still sharp. It was in Latin. I blinked. The next book German. The next Russian. A few in English, two classics, poetry, philosophy, history. My knees gave way and I sat on the floor surrounded by silence and secrets. And I did something I hadn't done in a long, long time. I smiled. I don't know how long I stayed in the library that day. There was no clock in the room. Just the sound of my breath, the weight of books pressing in around me, like old friends finally ready to speak, and a strange grounding silence I hadn't felt in years. I ran my fingers along spines that hadn't been touched in decades. Soft leather hand-stitched bindings, titles faded into shadows. Some books were so old their pages had turned the color of autumn leaves. Others still crackled when opened, full of pressed flowers and handwritten annotations in ink that had bled through time. The armchair in the corner was stiff at first, but when I sat down, it gave just enough, like the house was making room for me. For the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't afraid of stillness. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was uncomfortable. In truth, the bedroom was warm. The sheets smelled faintly of rose water and cedar, and the quiet wrapped around me like a protective shawl. But something tugged at me, a thought like an itch at the base of my spine. Why was this room hidden? Why would my grandmother, a woman I'd always assumed to be simple, reserved, maybe even lonely, build a secret library, then never mention it? What else had she kept from us? Or from me? I stared at the ceiling wide awake while wind whispered outside and tree branches tapped the windows like old fingers knocking gently at the past. Morning came like mist, slow and pale and soft. I brewed weak coffee on the old gas stove and stood by the kitchen window staring out at the frost-covered grass. In the daylight, the house looked even older, the paint more peeled, the wood more warped, and yet there was something strangely regal about it, like a queen who'd aged out of her court but still held her crown. I remembered the letter I hadn't finished reading, the one from the bowl. I unfolded it with care. The paper was thick, the ink steady her penmanship as precise as I remembered from childhood birthday cards and holiday notes. Claire, my dear girl, I know you may be angry, confused, or even hurt, but if you've opened this letter, it means you've returned. And that means there's still a thread between us, however frayed, however fragile. I want to tell you why I left the house to you, and why I hid so much from everyone else. There are things inside this home that cannot be explained in a will, or revealed at a table full of men in suits. Things that must be discovered slowly, patiently, with your own hands and eyes. You always had that in you, even when you didn't know it. I pressed the letter to my chest. She had chosen me not out of pity or guilt or obligation, but because she saw me. It was a truth more valuable than any inheritance. Later that afternoon, I returned to the library, this time with a flashlight and notepad. I intended to catalog the books at least loosely by language condition and any markings. But as I moved toward the far wall, my beam caught something strange. A seam in the paneling. Faint. Nearly invisible. But once seen, it couldn't be unseen. I stepped closer. The wood here was different, slightly newer, less worn. My fingers traced along the groove until I felt a shallow notch barely wider than a coin. I pressed. Nothing happened. I tried again. Still nothing. Then I remembered something, my grandmother's locket. I had found it tucked inside one of the bedside drawers the night before, gold oval with an engraving on the back. For what is hidden shall be revealed. I retrieved it from my suitcase and held it up to the notch. It didn't fit, but when I placed the flat side against the wood and pushed gently firmly, I heard it. A soft click. Then, the panel shifted. A hidden door. I held my breath as I pulled it open. Behind it was a narrow staircase, steep and cloaked in shadow, winding down into what must have been the basement. The air that spilled out smelled of earth, candle wax, and time. No part of me wanted to go down, but something deeper, the part of me that had always wanted to matter, to be chosen, to be trusted, told me I had to. So I went. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step a quiet dare. At the bottom, I found another door, this one wooden, thick with iron hinges. It wasn't locked, just heavy. I pushed. The room beyond was surprisingly large and dry. Stone walls, low beams, and in the center, under a hanging bulb that flickered to life when I found the chain, was an old metal safe. It looked ancient, heavy, serious. A safe in a basement hidden behind a secret door buried beneath a house no one wanted. My heart pounded. I knelt beside it. No keyhole, just a dial combination lock, the kind you'd see in old bank vaults. I tried the obvious 000. Nothing. Then my grandmother's birthday. Still locked. And then it came to me. She always remembered mine. When I was 7, she sent a package of books and a sweater she'd knitted by hand. When I was 13, a postcard from Maine with a pressed maple leaf tucked inside. She never forgot a year. Never forgot me. I spun the dial and entered my birth date. Click. The door released with a low metallic sigh. Inside were stacks of folders, tied bundles of letters, dusty photograph albums, and in the center a small wooden box carved with a sunburst. I reached for the letters first. They were addressed to no one, but they were written in her voice. I sat down on the floor and began to read. This house holds more than history. It holds. And truth. Claire is rarely clean. It's not always pretty. But it is yours now. And I believe you'll do what's right with it. There were records, too, appraisal signatures from rare book dealers, letters from museum curators. One page had a list of Latin titles and numbers scrawled beside them in red ink, a library catalog. Some of these books were worth more than apartments, more than the condo David got. Some were priceless. I put the papers down and looked around the basement, and for the first time in my life, I felt the beginnings of something I never thought I'd claim power. Not the kind that yells or wins arguments, but the kind that comes from knowledge, from being underestimated, from surviving. The kind that sits quietly smiling while others laugh because it knows something they don't. My grandmother had left me something far greater than anyone could see, and I was only just beginning to understand it. I didn't go back upstairs for hours. There in that stone-lined basement beneath a forgotten house in Vermont, I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by decades of secrets. Each letter, each faded photograph, each official document felt like a key to a door I didn't even know existed inside me. Some pages were brittle, written in delicate cursive that sloped slightly to the right, my grandmother's unmistakable hand. Others were firmer, more recent. And all of them were addressed not to a name, but to me the way a lighthouse speaks only to the one lost at sea. I opened one marked with a single date in the corner, August 2nd, 1998. Claire, if you found this, then you've chosen to stay. That alone tells me more than words ever could. You're the only one who would have come back without needing to be chased. That's why this house is yours, because you listen when no one else does. My breath caught. David was given the apartment because he's always needed bright lights and polished floors to feel important. But you never needed glitter. You just needed room to grow. Quietly. Like me. I closed my eyes. The words hit harder than I expected. I had spent most of my life trying to prove I was worth something. Worth loving. Worth fighting for. But my grandmother, the one person who'd always spoken in gentle silences, had already seen me even before I saw myself. The next letter was older, dated June 1975. It wasn't addressed to me, but to someone named LS, a name I didn't recognize. I read anyway. It's not safe to keep the entire catalog in one place. If anything happens, the Hollowbrook Library will remain untouched. Claire doesn't know it yet, but she's the one. I'm sure of it. The letter ended abruptly with a strange line. Legacy isn't passed through blood. It's passed through attention. That phrase looped in my mind like a melody I couldn't place. I returned to the wooden box in the center of the safe. It wasn't locked. Inside were three things: a velvet pouch, a folded cloth, and a small cassette tape labeled, "For Claire, play when you're ready." There wasn't a tape player in the house, not that I'd found. But the moment I picked it up, my chest ached with something I didn't have a name for. A mix of yearning and grief of a child waiting to be chosen, and finally, being chosen. Underneath the tape was a yellowed document folded into thirds. It was an appraisal. Official. Signed. Stamped. The library's estimated value between $3.6 million and $5.2 million, depending on market demand, rarity, and condition. I blinked. This was not just a forgotten room of dusty literature. It was a treasure chest hidden in plain sight, but one that only opened to the quiet, the patient, the overlooked. People like me. I needed air. The sun was starting to set when I stepped outside. Gray Hill was silent as always. The trees whispered as if the house had passed some kind of test, and I had been deemed worthy to know its truths. I sat on the front steps and watched the sky turn to amber. It hit me then, the timing. How everything had come to this moment. David thought I'd been slighted. Eric had called me worthless. My own mother hadn't even texted since the reading. But here I was, holding millions in knowledge, legacy, and something more intangible than all of it, a future that no one else could touch. That night, I lit the fireplace and sat with the velvet pouch in my lap. Inside was a key, old brass and marked with the initials R.W. I had no idea what had opened, but my grandmother had trusted I'd find out. Next to me on the rug were pages of letters still waiting. Some handwritten, some typed. One had a photograph paper clipped to the top, a black and white image of my grandmother in her 20s, standing in front of the very house I now lived in, holding a book like a sword. She looked fierce, alive in a way I'd never seen before. The note attached read, "This house raised 3 generations of women who survived more than anyone ever asked them to. You are the 4th. What you do next is up to you." I didn't cry, but I did feel something unlock in my chest, like a door that had been sealed shut for decades had creaked open just wide enough to let the light in. And in that light, I saw someone new. Me. The next morning, I woke to frost on the windows and a message on my phone. From David: "Hey. Heard you're still up there. That place must be awful. Want to trade? I'll take the dump, you can have the condo. Let's make it even." I stared at the screen. Even, this was the same man who laughed in my face during the will reading. The same man who hadn't called, hadn't cared until now. Until he suspected something. I typed a single reply. "No thank you. The house suits me." He didn't text back, but I smiled. Because it wasn't about the house anymore. It was about me finally learning to say no. To say yes only to myself. To choose a life built on something deeper than square footage and inheritance and appearances. That afternoon, I gathered the rest of the letters and brought them upstairs. The library would become my new workspace. Not just a room of relics, but a room of roots. Each day after that, I chose one letter, one volume, one memory to uncover. And with each choice, I began to feel like I wasn't just living inside my grandmother's legacy. I was becoming it. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It's not the silence of being ignored or left behind. I knew that kind well. It's the kind that wraps around you like a heavy quilt on a cold night. The kind that says you're safe here. No one's watching. You can become whoever you want. That's what the house gave me. Not comfort exactly, but permission to exist without explanation. And for the first time in my life, I accepted it. I spent the next 3 days like a woman possessed, cataloging, stacking, photographing. The books in the hidden library were more than old, they were curated, intentionally. Some bore royal stamps from Eastern European empires I barely remembered from college. Others had university seals, author signatures, and marginalia from hands that trembled with age or authority. My grandmother wasn't just a collector. She had been a guardian. I made a spreadsheet on my laptop and created folders of digital photos, careful to use natural light and clean backgrounds. I labeled everything, language, condition, binding type notations. Some entries had my hands shaking with wonder. A Latin manuscript from the 15th century. A French edition of Candide printed before the Revolution. A Russian philosophical treatise with a personal letter tucked inside, written it seemed by someone close to Tolstoy himself. By the end of day 3, I realized I had documented only one wall. There were 6 more. That evening, I sat by the fireplace, legs tucked under me, a glass of tea cooling in my palm. The house felt warmer than usual, not just from the fire, but from something deeper. A strange thought formed. What if I don't sell any of it? What if I stayed? Not just in Grey Hill, but here, in this house, in this life. What if I turned the library into a foundation, a research archive, a private museum? What if this inheritance wasn't meant to be liquidated but lived in? The thought terrified me, but it also thrilled me in a way nothing had for years. Still, I needed perspective. I needed someone who understood the value, both monetary and cultural, of what I was holding. So I reached out. I found him through a rare book forum, an expert named Caleb Rourke based in Boston, 40-ish, specializing in European manuscripts, private libraries, and estate appraisals. His reviews were glowing, discreet, professional. I sent him a polite message with a few sample photos. He replied in less than 2 hours. "Would you be available for a site visit? These items are extraordinary." He arrived 2 days later. Caleb was taller than I expected, with dark hair and the kind of quiet voice that people lean in to hear. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, just offered a warm handshake and asked where the collection was housed. When I led him to the hidden library, his face changed. He didn't speak for a full minute. Then, "You understand what this is, don't you?" I nodded slowly. "I think so. But I want to hear it from you." He pulled on a pair of white cotton gloves from his satchel, the kind I'd only ever seen in documentaries, and began examining the shelves like a museum curator walking through a dream. He whispered to himself sometimes, "Unbelievable. Original binding. Oh my God, is this a 1631? I stood back and let him work. After an hour, he turned to me, his expression somewhere between reverence and disbelief. "Claire," he said carefully, "this isn't a private library. It's a lost archive. Some of these books haven't been publicly cataloged in centuries. A few are so rare I've only seen them in photographs. One, I swear to you, may have belonged to the Romanov family." I felt the blood rush from my face. "How much is it all worth?" He took a breath. "I can't give you a final number without weeks of work, but just from what I've seen today." He paused. "At auction, it could start around $8 to $10 million, possibly more depending on provenance. In private sales, the sky's the limit." I sat down. Hard. He stayed for hours after that, documenting select titles, making notes. He offered to connect me with legal experts, private archivists, and even museum curators interested in long-term preservation partnerships. But I hesitated, because even as he spoke about value and rarity and cultural importance, my mind kept going back to that first letter in the ceramic bowl. Some things cannot be explained in a will. They must be discovered with your own hands. I wasn't ready to give it away. Not yet. Later that night, I made a fire and pulled out one of the older journals from the safe. Not a book, not a letter, just a worn leather diary filled with slanted cursive and ink smudges. It belonged to my great-grandmother. Inside were daily musings about rain, gardening, loss, and longing, and tucked between the pages a pressed blue cornflower and a quote, "We are not what we inherit. We are what we do with it." That night I barely slept, but not from fear, from a feeling I hadn't known in years: possibility. The next morning I found a voicemail on my phone. It was David again. "Claire. Hey, just checking in. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. You know how stressful that reading was. Anyway, I've been thinking maybe we could talk about the house. I could help you fix it up. Maybe we could even sell it together. You know, equal partners." He paused. "Let's not make this into some weird sibling thing. Just call me." I didn't call back. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. But I had learned something in the past week. When people start to suspect you've been given something valuable, not just in money, but in meaning, they don't see you differently. They just want what they think is rightfully theirs. And David had never once asked me what was in the house, only what it was worth. That evening I sat by the fire again, journal open, pen in hand. I wrote, "I am not the forgotten one anymore. I am the keeper, the daughter, the heir, the witness." And for the first time I believed it. Not just in theory, but in my bones. It started with a knock. Not the hesitant kind, not the kind that waits politely for permission. It was sharp, entitled, familiar. I peeked through the window and felt my stomach coil. David. He stood on the front porch in a crisp gray coat, wool scarf tucked with the precision of someone who dressed to impress, even when surrounded by moss, mud, and pine needles. His shoes, I noticed, were clean. Too clean for someone who'd just trekked down Hollow Brook Road. Which meant he hadn't. He'd hired a driver. Of course. I didn't open the door right away. Instead, I took a breath, the kind of breath you take before walking into a courtroom. Or a battlefield. Then I turned the knob and opened the door slowly. "Claire," he said with a practiced smile. "Wow. You stayed." "You came," I answered. There was a moment of silence where neither of us blinked. Then, with a chuckle too loud for the quiet air, He stepped forward as if invited. I didn't move. Shoes off, I said flatly. And no, I don't have coffee. He hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the change in tone. The last time we spoke in person, I was the one standing small in that sterile lawyer's office clutching a manila envelope like a consolation prize. Now I stood in the doorway of something far greater, and I didn't need to smile to prove it. He finally took off his shoes, placed them neatly by the mat, and followed me into the kitchen. I almost didn't recognize the place, he said, glancing around. Still smells like old wood and ghosts. That's cedar and rosemary, I replied, motioning to the simmer pot on the stove. Ghosts tend to prefer bergamot. He gave a dry laugh, then got to the point. Listen, I know we didn't exactly handle the inheritance thing well. Tensions were high, but I've been thinking, maybe we acted too fast. Maybe it wasn't fair. I raised an eyebrow. You mean the part where you got a Manhattan condo, and I got what you called a shack with termites? That part. He ignored the jab, shifting gears. Let's be honest here. This place, it's charming, sure, in a Jane Austen meets reality TV kind of way, but you don't want to be stuck out here, right? Winter's coming. Isolation, repairs, mold. Look, I'm offering you a deal. Let's swap. He said it like he was offering a trade of baseball cards. You give me the house, I'll give you the apartment. Straight up. I stared at him for a full 5 seconds. Then I leaned against the counter and folded my arms. Why? What do you mean? Why now you didn't want it before? You laughed when I got it. You said, what was it? Maybe you can start a chicken farm. And now suddenly you're dying to live in Grey Hill Clare, he said, the smile tightening. Come on. You've never been great with upkeep. It's a beautiful old house, but let's be honest. What are you going to do with it? You don't even drive a stick. Or chop wood. But I read, I said quietly. He blinked. What I read. I catalog. I preserve. I protect. You wouldn't understand, but this house isn't a burden. It's a responsibility. And I'm finally ready for it. So this is personal now. It always was. He shifted uncomfortably. The silence stretched. Then he tried again, this time softer. Look, Claire, I know you're upset, but I've got plans for that space. I could renovate it, flip it, even turned it into an artist retreat. We could make money. You and I, we could co-own, share profits. Think about it. A full restoration could double the property value in a year. You're talking like a developer, I said. But this house doesn't need flipping. It needs honoring. His voice sharpened. Are you going to keep clinging to some dusty library and nostalgia when you could have an asset in New York City? I smiled slowly, not politely. David, I said gently, you already have your asset. Remember, you won. Claire, don't be stubborn, and don't mistake quiet for weak. He stood there fuming, then scoffed and reached for his coat. Fine, enjoy your musty fortress of solitude. But don't come crying to me when winter caves your roof in, or the plumbing fails, or the town forgets you exist. I won't, I said, holding his gaze. And for the record, they haven't forgotten me. Who the squirrels? I walked him to the door. Just as he stepped outside, I added, Tell me, David, how much did you offer for the house when you found out what it was worth? 10 million. 12. Who tipped you off? His jaw clenched. No one tipped me off. You just guessed, I finished for him. Sure. Then I closed the door, not loudly, not angrily, just enough for it to click in a way that said, we're done here. I stood there for a long moment, forehead pressed against the cool wood, listening to the sound of his expensive shoes crunching the gravel as he walked away. And I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel pride. I felt solid, anchored. For the first time, I had something he wanted, not because it glittered, but because it meant something. And I wasn't going to hand it over. Not this time. Later that evening, I took down one of the oldest books from the top shelf, A Latin tome with pages that whispered when turned and settled into the reading chair with a blanket across my legs. The fire crackled softly. Outside, frost clung to the windows. And inside, something in me burned quietly but fiercely. I was no longer the woman people left behind. I was the woman they underestimated. And now, they were knocking on my door. After David left, the house settled into silence again. But this time, it wasn't the kind of silence that follows abandonment. It was intentional, like the house had been holding its breath, waiting for me to say no, waiting to see if I would flinch. I didn't. Instead, I walked back into the library, sat at the wide oak desk beneath the window, and opened the thickest leather-bound volume I could find. On its first page was a family crest, intricate looping with a crown at the top, and a Latin phrase etched beneath. Memoria est forma veritatis. Memory is the shape of truth. I ran my fingers over the words. Then I turned the page. Over the next few days, I read like someone racing a clock. Each book seemed to open a new door. I found old census records, maps of Vermont drawn by hand, faded letters from Eastern Europe receipts, and shipping manifests from the early 1900s. And tucked behind the third bookshelf was something I never expected, a wooden crate sealed with wax and marked RW. The same initials as the brass key in the velvet pouch. My heart knocked once hard in my chest. I used the key. Inside was a trove of brittle documents wrapped in oilcloth. I unfolded them slowly, one by one. Some were land grants from the 1800s. Others were personal diaries from women I had never heard of, but whose blood likely ran through my veins. Rebecca Whitman, 1862. The town calls this house a ruin, but I say ruins are simply foundations that haven't found their next story yet. Marguerite Whitman, 1917. They laughed when I used the parlor for classes, but the girls come. They learn. Their minds bloom. That's enough for me. Eleanor Whitman, 1955. I dreamt again of the fire. I heard the books scream. I woke and wept. They are more than parchment. They carry us. I wept when I read that one, because by then I understood. This house wasn't just an inheritance. It was a lineage of women who had endured, resisted, rebuilt, not with noise, not with power, but with books and letters and silence that shaped futures. And I was next. That night I spread the documents across the living room floor and mapped out what I had found. I made a family tree using Post-its and index cards. I traced the journey of each woman who had lived here, what she left behind, what she preserved, what she refused to let the world erase. It was like weaving a quilt out of ink and dust. When I was done, I stepped back and looked at the timeline stretching across the room. Each generation had added something to the house: a wing, a bookcase, a library, a secret. And now, it was my turn. The next morning, I visited the attic, a place I hadn't dared to enter since arriving. It was dusty, cold, and dimly lit, but the moment I opened the hatch, I knew it had been used. By someone who cared. Boxes were labeled in delicate script, press clippings, 1923-1950. Letters unsent, photographs, France 1938, women's meetings, 1960s, 1974. I opened one box labeled banned. Inside were pamphlets, pages torn from books, and handwritten essays, all marked with red stamps: rejected, inappropriate, denied. They were writing on women's rights, suffrage, reproductive health, and education. My grandmother hadn't just collected old volumes, she'd collected voices that were nearly erased, and she had hidden them here. I sat in the attic for hours, slowly, carefully organizing the contents by theme. The idea began to form like mist taking shape in the morning sun. What if I turned the house into an archive? Not just for scholars, but for women like me who had been overlooked, dismissed, called too quiet, too emotional, or too late. What if this home, this so-called crumbling relic, became a sanctuary of memory? What if the legacy wasn't just about inheritance, but interruption? interrupting the story the world had tried to tell me about who I was and writing my own. That night, I lit a candle in the library. I placed it on the floor and sat cross-legged just like I used to as a girl when my grandmother read to me. I pulled out one of the journals from the crate. On the inside cover was a line. To the woman who comes next, you're not the first to be forgotten, but you could be the first to be remembered on her terms. I whispered aloud to no one in particular, I will be. And in the quiet that followed, I felt the house breathe with me. For the first time, we were not strangers. We were partners. They say old houses have souls. I used to think that was just a romantic metaphor, something people said to justify creaky floorboards and faulty wiring. But after everything I had uncovered, I no longer doubted it. This house wasn't haunted. It was alive, and it was waiting. The first thing I did was call the local historical society. Not out of obligation, but because I needed allies. I spoke to a woman named Marilyn Green who answered the phone with the kind of Vermont drawl that felt like a wool sweater's soft, scratchy reel. The Whitman house, she said. My stars. Haven't heard that name in a while. I told her about the library, about the attic archives, about the legacy. She asked me to send photos. I did. 2 hours later, she showed up at my doorscarf, flying boots, muddy eyes wide. Claire, she said, her voice trembling, this isn't just important. This is historical salvation. Do you understand what you've been sitting on? Only recently, I said, smiling. This could be the only complete female-curated archive in the county, possibly the state, maybe the Northeast. She took a step back and looked at me differently than not like I was a woman who'd been handed a fluke inheritance, but like I was a steward. Word spread faster than I expected. Within a week, I'd received emails from 3 nearby universities, 2 museums, and a nonprofit that preserves women's history. Each wanted to visit, to help, to partner. And just like that, the narrative shifted. The house was no longer a crumbling farmhouse. It was a repository of women's voices, a living memory, a radical act of preservation. And I was no longer the sister who got the short end. I was the woman who kept the fire lit. But something else shifted too. The townspeople, the ones who had watched me arrive with 2 suitcases and tired eyes, began to see me. A man named Harold from the general store started leaving bags of apples by my gate. For baking, he'd scribble on the note. Agnes, a retired schoolteacher, stopped me at the post office. I knew your grandmother. Tough as boot leather, but kind. I'm glad it's you who came back. And Yara, the woman who ran the cafe in town, offered her teenage daughter to help with scanning documents on weekends. It'll look good on college apps, she said, but her eyes were warmer than her voice. They weren't just helping, they were returning. To the house, to the legacy, to the idea that some women didn't disappear, they just went quiet until someone was ready to listen. I hired a carpenter named Eli, who came with strong hands, and the kind of gentleness you don't expect in someone who lifts beams for a living. I don't restore houses, he warned me. I revive them. And yours? It wants to stand. He patched the roof, reinforced the floors, sanded the staircase back to its original grain. He found carvings beneath layers of paint initials from 1901. He paused before touching them. You want me to leave these? Yes, I said. They're part of the story. Even the house seemed to approve. The air inside was warmer, lighter. One day, while removing rotted planks from the garden fence, Eli unearthed a rusted metal box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all black and white. Women gathered in circles, teaching, weaving, reading to children, leading meetings in the parlor. At the bottom was a handwritten card. We built what they called invisible. I pressed the photo to my chest. Not anymore, I whispered. Weeks passed like chapters. Each morning began with black coffee gloves and archival tape. Each evening ended with a fire, a journal entry, and a single candle lit on the mantel for the women who came before. The house began to breathe easier. So did I. I began drafting plans, a digital archive for scholars and students, a reading room for the public, a summer retreat program for women writers, and one day, a permanent Whitman Women's History Center. I wasn't just living in my grandmother's house, I was continuing her revolution. And then in the middle of all this came another letter. No stamp, no return address. It was slipped through the mail slot in the middle of the night. I found it the next morning on the doormat. The envelope was thick linen and old-fashioned. Inside was a single piece of paper. You don't know everything. Ask about 1932. Ask about the missing ledger. A friend. I stared at the message, my hands cold. A chill crept across my back. What was the missing ledger? And who was watching me? I folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the desk drawer with the other letters. For now, I had a legacy to protect. But some part of me, the part that had learned to listen to old houses and quiet voices, whispered that there was more. More than history, more than inheritance, and perhaps more than one betrayal. I read the anonymous letter again that night, 10 times, 20. You don't know everything. Ask about 1932. Ask about the missing ledger. A friend. I stared at the words until they stopped looking like English. What was in 1932? There had been no mention of that year in any of the journals or letters I'd found. No photos dated to that time. No entries in the family tree. It was as if the year had been erased or hidden on purpose, and that made me uneasy. The next morning, I pulled every folder, diary, and catalog from the basement and the attic, laying them out across the floor like puzzle pieces. I went line by line, month by month. Then, silence. The next documented entry didn't appear until 1935, a 3-year void, in a family of women who documented everything. Every rainfall, every apple harvest, every poem scribbled in the margins of a grocery list. 3 silent years was louder than any scream. It wasn't an oversight, it was an omission. And omissions, I'd learned, were rarely innocent. I began digging. I searched the back of every drawer, every loose floorboard, every storage trunk in the barn. Nothing. Until the library. The bottom shelf behind the volumes of European law. That's where I noticed a small sliver of space narrower than my hand. I reached in and felt something solid, thin, wrapped in cloth. I pulled gently. It slid out like it had been waiting. A black leather ledger, unmarked, bound with twine, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with weight. My hands shook as I untied the knot. The pages inside were filled with numbers, names, transactions, invoices. Most were written in crisp black ink, a few in red, all dated 1931 to 1933. At first glance, it looked like bookkeeping, boring, mundane, meaningless. But I recognized some of the names. Local surnames. A few still existed in Town Green, Morley, Wadsworth. And then I saw it. One line near the middle. October 3rd, 1932. Received payment from D.L. Whitman for transfer of deed. Vault sealed. Inventory altered. No disclosure. Signed R.W. I froze. D.L. Whitman. That was Daniel Lawrence Whitman, my great-great-grandfather. The man in the old portraits in the hallway. A respected judge, a philanthropist, a Whitman. And R.W. Rebecca Whitman, his daughter. The same woman who wrote about the fire. The same one who had carved initials into the attic beams. Vault sealed. Inventory altered. No disclosure. I read it again. Then again. And then it hit me. This ledger wasn't just tracking property or payments, it was tracking a cover-up. I ran outside, heart pounding, into the backyard where the earth had softened from the previous night's rain. I circled to the west side of the house, the only part with no windows, no landscaping. There was a slight depression in the ground, like something heavy had once been buried there. Eli had mentioned oddness in the foundation weeks ago, a section of stone that didn't match. I hadn't thought anything of it. Until now. I grabbed a shovel from the barn. I didn't stop to think. I just dug. 3 feet down, I hit wood. Old, rotted, but intact. I cleared the dirt away and pried it open. Inside was a box. Metal. Rusted. Locked with a thick latch. I lifted it out with both arms and carried it into the library, dirt trailing behind me like breadcrumbs from a story no one wanted told. It took me nearly an hour to crack it open. Inside was a collection of tightly wrapped documents, sealed letters, yellowed photographs, court transcripts, and one thick envelope labeled to be destroyed. R.W. But it hadn't been. And now, it was mine to open. Inside that envelope were letters between Daniel Whitman and multiple town officials. They detailed a plan to conceal a collection of rare volumes believed to be controversial at the time, books by female philosophers, religious texts outside the mainstream, journals detailing miscarriages, abuse, mental illness, sexuality, all stored in a vault below the house, all deemed inappropriate for public record, and all ordered to be hidden by Daniel Whitman himself. I kept reading. A court document from 1932 revealed a property transfer made in secret, moving ownership of the land to Rebecca Whitman, under the condition that the vault be sealed permanently and the contents never made public. Rebecca signed, but she never destroyed the records. She simply buried them. The realization felt like thunder. My family, the one I thought had quietly preserved women's knowledge for generations, had also been complicit in burying it. Preservation and suppression, side by side, a legacy not just of memory, but of control. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the library and stared at the documents spread across the floor, wondering how many other stories like this had been sealed, silenced, rewritten to suit someone else's narrative. The ledger had never been meant for me. But I had it now, and what I did next mattered. I picked up my phone and called Marilyn from the Historical Society. I found something, I told her. Something big. But it's not just about books anymore. It's about what was hidden. And why, Claire? She said after a long pause. Are you sure you want to open that door? I looked at the safe, the documents, the generations of women staring down from the photographs on the walls. I think I said quietly, that door was never meant to stay closed. It took me 3 days to read through all the contents of the metal box. 3 days of old paper slicing my fingers, of whispered truths crawling through my mind like ivy under the floorboards. 3 days of reconciling the grandmother I loved with the family that had buried so much. Each document chipped away at the polished version of our lineage, the proud Whitman family of judges, donors, and educators, and exposed a shadow no one ever spoke of. The truth. We had preserved brilliance, but we had also buried rebellion, and I couldn't be the next to do both. I stood before the fireplace that evening, the original ledger and its copies laid out on the table behind me. The house was quiet but not empty. I felt every generation in the walls, in the grain of the wood, in the places where women had once whispered, "Just write it down, someone will need it someday." Now that someone was me. And I had a choice. Seal it back up and protect the family name, or break the silence. I chose the latter. The next morning I met Marilyn at the Historical Society building. She stood waiting on the porch, eyes wide, as I handed her a sealed manila envelope. Inside, I said, is a ledger no one was ever supposed to read. It proves what was taken, what was hidden, and who made those decisions. Claire, she whispered. This could change everything. It should, I said. And it must. We held a press conference the following week. Nothing grand. Just a folding table under the elm tree in front of the town hall, a few reporters from local papers, a couple of professors who'd driven in from Dartmouth, and a half-curious crowd of townspeople. I stood in the wind papers clutched in my hand and told the truth. About the Whitman family. About the vault. About the books deemed dangerous because they were written by women or spoke of things no man wanted to admit existed. About the secret transfer of property and the ledger that tracked every quiet betrayal. I expected anger. I expected pushback. What I didn't expect was the silence, a heavy, breathless stillness as I finished. And then someone clapped. It started slow, then spread. And in that moment, I felt the house behind me, the memory of it, the weight of it exhale. Reporters came, journalists, researchers, not to sensationalize but to learn, to honor, to document the kind of hidden history that doesn't make textbooks. The Whitman Women's Archive became a living project with interns' digitization grants and a rotating exhibition of banned works curated by young female scholars. I turned the east wing of the house into a reading room. The parlor became a lecture space. The attic, an oral history recording booth where local women came to speak the truths they'd never written down. I kept the fire going in the evenings, always, a quiet promise to the ones who came before: you were not erased, you were just waiting. David called once, left a voicemail. Hey, so, I saw the news. I guess, congratulations, I didn't realize it was so serious. The whole women's center thing. Honestly, I didn't think you had it in you. But hey, good for you. I didn't call back. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to be heard by him anymore. I had found my voice elsewhere. One afternoon, I found a letter tucked between two books in the back of the library. It was short, a single sentence unsigned. You did what I couldn't. Thank you. I never found out who wrote it. Maybe it was a Whitman, maybe not. Maybe that didn't matter. On the first anniversary of my arrival in Greyhill, we held a candlelight gathering in the garden behind the house. Dozens of women came. Some brought books to donate. Some brought names of ancestors whose stories had never been told. Some simply came to listen. We sat in a circle under the stars. No microphones, no slogans, just stories. Painful ones, powerful ones, unfinished ones. And when my turn came, I didn't read a prepared speech. I just stood up, looked around, and said, they tried to bury us. They tried to shame us. They tried to call us irrelevant. But we're still here, and we remember. The farmhouse no longer leaned. Its bones had been reinforced, but its soul had never been stronger. Visitors still asked me, why didn't your grandmother just tell someone? Why didn't she publish the collection? And I always answered the same. She was waiting, not for the right moment, but for the right woman. And this time, the silence ended with me. Have you ever been given something that felt like a burden? But did it turn out to be your turning point? Maybe it was a broken promise, a silent goodbye, an inheritance no one else wanted. I thought I was being discarded, but really I was being redirected to something that finally belonged to me. Drop a comment and tell me, what did life hand you that you turned into your power? You never know who your story might inspire. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember that sometimes what they leave you with becomes exactly what sets you free.